Welcome to the first session of the course on Nietzsche at Unregistered Academy. I am your humble teacher, Thaddeus Russell. Please call me Thad if you're ever in any of my classes. When I was a real professor at colleges and universities, I used to insist that my students not call me Professor Russell. I told them to call me Thad. So, of course, that goes for the grown-up people who take our courses, who are, of course, my peers. So yes, please call me Thad. So this is our course on Nietzsche. I have been teaching Nietzsche since 1997 when I was a lecturer, a teacher in the Great Books program at Columbia University when I was a graduate student. I had the great fortune and honor to get a position teaching in that program, which is a survey of Western philosophy from the pre-Socratics to the present. And Nietzsche is around midway, being of the mid-19th century. He's about midway through that narrative, maybe 2/3 of the way through. And that was the first time. Well, I had also taken a Nietzsche colloquium as an undergraduate. And this is the book we read in that colloquium. This was like an advanced sort of seminar in my college just on Nietzsche. And I've since then, that's in 1986 or 7. And I was just looking through my underlining in this book the other day, and I didn't know anything about Nietzsche after that course. I have learned a lot about Nietzsche since then from teaching him again when I was more able to understand his ideas. And then I've taught him many times since then, subsequently. So over the last 20 plus years. And I would say that I am some form of Nietzschean. Let's put our cards on the table. I think that's essential for any teacher teaching anything like this. I have my disagreements. I will certainly talk about those, so we're very clear. But no, I am. If you know my work, if you know A Renegade History of the United States, if you know Unregistered Podcast, if you have a sense of my worldview, you should pretty quickly identify me as one of those Nietzscheans we've been hearing about. One of the very, very interesting things about Nietzsche is that he has appealed to possibly the most interesting list of acolytes I've ever seen for any philosopher. I listed some of them in the course announcement, but let's talk about that right now. So we have both people on the left and the right. We have very famously, of course, the Nazis. Not all, but many were, in fact, clearly, explicitly influenced by Nietzsche. Then we had Italian fascists as well, and we just completed our course on fascism here at the Academy. And you can probably already think about some of the ways, if you've read Nietzsche, some of the ways in which, yes, there is some overlap. There is some, at least, overlap in between Nietzsche's thinking and the thinking of the actual original fascists. And this is something I want you all to think about as we read Nietzsche himself. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Jordan Peterson's word for it, what Nietzsche meant, what he said. We're going to read a substantial portion of the text for all 4 of his major books, his most important books. And this is why I say in the course announcement, yes, you will be able to engage in serious scholarly debate about the meaning of Nietzsche's work and philosophy, because we're going to look at it. So, but while we're looking at it, that's the number one question I have for you to keep always in your mind as we are reading the text itself, reading Nietzsche himself. Was he a fascist? Is this fascism? Is it any sort of precursor of justification or intellectual rationale for what became fascism in the 20th century, just a couple decades after he wrote this book that we're about to read today? Think about that. My answer is maybe, but this is really the first question for you. The second question is, why has he also been influential among people on the radical left? Not liberals. And by the way, I mean both classical liberals. I think this is right. Both classical liberals and 20th century liberals, two different species, but both called it. I think those are the two groups who are clearly not Nietzschean. But again, I want you to keep this in mind. Keep in mind politics as we're reading this. And some people have argued that the first book that we're studying today, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is actually a prescription about art. I think that's wrong. I think even if it were, though, about art, that it certainly has political applications that have been made. And Nietzsche was a political person. Why is it that both Nazis and Italian fascists and Michel Foucault were highly influenced by Nietzsche and said so? Foucault was right up front about it. Why is it that many anarchists of the 20th century and the 21st century also claim Nietzsche as their chief inspiration? When I was in college in the 1980s, we actually had a contingent of anarchists who later on became the original Antifa in Seattle. Those were my buddies in high school. We're the sort of founders of the Antifa movement in the Northwest. And they all were the ones who first told me about Nietzsche. That's how I found out about Friedrich Nietzsche, was from my left-wing commie anarchist buddies back in the 1980s. How can that be? So when we're reading the text itself, ask yourself that question and try to come up with an answer. And I might even put some of you on the spot to do that. But that's the only way. I think that's the most important and interesting way to study this. He's also been very influential among many great novelists. Marcel Proust is just one example. Kafka would be another example. Charles Bukowski, yet another. So across countries, across time, and across political ideologies and cultural sensibilities. I think several of the beat poets of the 1950s also mention Nietzsche as a muse. Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party claimed Nietzsche as one of his own in terms of intellectual influences. You know who's not been a Nietzschean, and this is very clear, and there's no one would disagree with me on this, I promise you. Marxists, not Nietzschean, along with classical liberals and modern liberals. When I say modern liberals, I mean like New Deal liberals, the Democratic Party of today. They're not Nietzschean. Classical liberals, like a particular type of libertarian, we're talking John Locke, Adam Smith, that lineage, that tradition, not Nietzschean. In fact, I'm going to say it's antagonistic to the Nietzschean set of beliefs. Ask yourself that too as we're reading the text. Does this have anything to do? Is this a friend or an enemy of Thomas Jefferson? Right? That way of thinking, classical liberalism, the self-regulating individual, that idea that's at the core of classical liberalism. Is that who the Ubermensch is? So think about that as well. The other group that I have seen, and this is one of the reasons I taught this course now, is that I've seen Nietzsche's name being mentioned quite a lot recently, is a group that might not even be a group, but people have identified it as a group. And it has had many names. 5 years ago, it was called the alt-right. Now some people call it the new right. I think it is the online right. I would say their leaders are Bronze Age Pervert and Curtis Yarvin, and those are two different wings. They're not; those two have differences. Bronze Age Pervert, who is very, very influential in ways that people don't even know about, but his book, Bronze Age Mindset, about which we have a course at Unregistered Academy, by the way, one of my favorite courses. I love being surprised by a book, and I certainly was by that one. But he's extremely influential, not just in the alt-right and the new right. He's being passed around among congressional staffers on Capitol Hill. Many, many such stories of Republican staffers in Congress being fans of BAP. Now, I don't know if any Congress people are, but I would imagine at least several of them have at least heard of him. I'm sure J.D. Vance knows all about him. Much of the MAGA movement is also influenced by BAP. And he is an outright explicit Nietzschean. He's devoted many episodes of his podcast to Nietzsche and his influence on him. And you can see it in many ways. And I want you to, if you know anything about that world, not just Bronze Age Pervert, but the sort of that online alt-right world, and I want you to think about not necessarily their opinions about monarchy or the state or what. I want you to think about what I think is most important to them, masculinity. Is that why? Is that why Bronze Age Pervert and all these alt-right frog Twitter guys, is that why they like Nietzsche? Because you'll see when we read him, when we read Nietzsche, you'll see that masculinity is quite important to Friedrich. So I think there's a very important thing. So another thing to keep your eyes open to as we're reading the text. Now, my approach to studying and teaching philosophy, which is what we're doing here, is textualist, which is to say that I try actually to teach the text in a vacuum. Anytime I add context, anytime any teacher adds what they call add context to a text to attempt to help you understand it, what are they doing? It may not be a bad thing, but what are they doing? They're telling you how to interpret it, because they're saying this particular context that I'm giving you, the year he was born, the city he was born in, the war that was happening, whenever he was, that I'm telling you that is what's important in understanding the text, right? That you can't understand the text without understanding the context and particular context. So I try, and I've always tried ever since I started teaching the Great Books course at Columbia 30 years ago, to give as little context actually as possible, because I simply think it stops students from understanding the text on their own. I also think that these texts, the reason they're great books, the reason we teach courses on them over and over again, is that they are important in our society and Western civilization, not because of the year in which Nietzsche was born or the war that was happening when he was a young man, but because of the ideas that are simply in the text on their own. That is what we talk about. That is what influences us. That's what makes us think. It's what inspires us. It causes some of us to start political movements, but not because of what was happening in Prussia in the 19th century. It's the ideas themselves, yeah, in a vacuum, essentially. Now, having said that, I'm going to violate my pedagogical principle a little bit here tonight. I am going to give you some context, because I think it is, in this case, essential to not, I guess I'm not understanding necessarily the core messages of Nietzsche, what he wanted to convey. But as you'll see, Nietzsche, in my view, and in the view of many sort of literary scholars who have analyzed the text as literature, and by the way, Zarathustra, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is a novel. It's written as a novel. You could call it just a work of philosophy, but it's written as a novel. Forgot where I was there. The textual. Textual, right. So the textual integrity. I think, sorry. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I think you will agree with me, and many literary theorists have agreed on this, is a text that is in dialogue with other texts. That's largely how I read it. I see him as in dialogue with the Bible in particular and other philosophers. And there's sort of, in a way, a back and forth in Nietzsche's mind. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that many people think that he was a schizophrenic. And I would not argue strenuously against that, by the way. Can a schizophrenic be a brilliant philosopher who offers wisdom that changes the lives of centuries of people? Yeah, I think so. And I think Nietzsche actually proves that. There's no question. He was deemed insane at the time. As you'll see in a minute, we'll look at the timeline of his life in a minute, but he was, and he was incarcerated in a mental asylum. But I think there would be no time in history since the 1870s when he was put in that asylum, no time in, at least in the West and probably in most of the world, when he would not have been classified as mentally ill, insane, schizophrenic, psychotic by psychiatrists. I think by anybody, by any of the psychological industries standards, he would be considered insane. So I do think there is a dialogue. And the thing is that's interesting is that guess what schizophrenics, has been said about them. They create alternative worlds in which they spend much of their time in conversation with the people, the figures, the spirits, whoever it is that populates their world. That's what they do. And this is, we know this from many memoirs of schizophrenics. Fascinating stuff. And some people have wondered whether those figures in their mind, those people they're talking to in their minds are real in some important way. But we do know this, and you may have been around schizophrenics. What are they often doing? Usually doing? They're talking to somebody. They're in conversation. And I think as you see from this text, Nietzsche in large part is in conversation with other texts. And so that's why we need to understand what those other texts are and when they were. So I'll get to that in a minute. Now let's look at his life, at least a sort of a timeline of his life. So here we have this. Let's see. So he was born in Roken. I don't know how to pronounce that. Roken, Prussia. In 1844. Look at the next point on the timeline. What's this doing here, Thad? Well, that's my choice, of course. I chose to put this in Nietzsche's timeline. 18. So when he was 14 years old, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, or On the Origin of Species. Get to that in a minute. But just note that with a big, bright yellow marker in your mind for the moment. He's born into a middle-class family. His father was a pastor. Interestingly, not a lot is known about his father, and not a lot is known about Nietzsche's views of his father or of his theology. But that is certainly something to keep in mind. And I think it partly explains why, as I said, he is so much in dialogue with the Bible in this book and in other books. So, but he has a scholarly mind, an intellectual mind from an early age. He sort of knows when he's, I think, a child still, that he needs to pursue a life of the mind. And so very quickly, he begins studying classical philology at Bonn University. Philology, which no longer really exists as an academic field, was essentially, and certainly with Nietzsche, is essentially the study of the history of languages and the cultures that have been associated with those languages. So, right, it's essentially anthropology, cultural studies, and philosophy. And that's one of the reasons, kind of the main reason philology faded out, because it was somewhat superfluous with other departments, other fields. So Nietzsche's really studying philosophy from the beginning. And as a young man. He then, though, by 1869, and look at the age here, he's 24 years old. He gets a job, he gets appointed to be a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And to take that job, in part, I don't think it was required, but he renounced his Prussian citizenship and then moved to Basel. And he remained stateless, essentially, for the rest of his life. The next year, though, and again, there's not enough known about why he did this, but it's a turning point in his life in many ways. The Franco-Prussian War is happening, and he actually volunteers to serve as an orderly, a medical orderly, not a fighter, with the Prussian military. And he does so, and he tells horrific stories about it, about being treating men, of course, with catastrophic wounds, etc. But he also, from his close contact with all those men who at the time, this was trench warfare. What was the main reason that the leading cause of death to soldiers during that period in European wars was disease, of course. So Nietzsche contracted dysentery and diphtheria from the trenches, and he contracted syphilis from the local whorehouse. That is not absolutely substantiated, but Walter Kaufmann, who is the first and still leading biographer of Nietzsche, believes that he got syphilis while he was serving as a medical orderly in that war, in a whorehouse. It shattered his health, and this becomes kind of aside from his, of course, intellectual pursuits, that becomes kind of the main story of Nietzsche's life from then on. His health from 1870 onward just declines in a linear way until his death at the age of 55. So he's 24 years old, okay, in this year, when he's in the war. Sorry, he's 25. A year before, he was 24 when he became professor, right? 24-year-old professor the year before. Then when he's 25, he's in the war, gets horribly sick, and his health never recovered after that. He publishes his first great work, his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, in 1872, 2 years later. And he continues to teach at Basel, becoming somewhat of an academic star. But then 77 years later, his health has deteriorated so much that he actually has to resign, still as a very young man. And he also, for the rest of his life, because of that, lived with friends and benefactors and patrons, kind of across Europe. He was kind of itinerant, one might say, semi-homeless. He published a handful of copies of his books at this time. Thus, believe it or not, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the book we're going to look at tonight. He published, I think it was 100 copies. That was the print run, the initial print run for that book, which became his most, and still is, his most popular and famous book. So The Birth of Tragedy is in 1872. He resigns from academia from Basel in 79, and then is just sort of what we would now call a public intellectual, struggling to make his way. But he writes many books during this period. These are just the most prominent and important. 82 is The Gay Science. 83, as I said, is this one, Zarathustra. 86, Beyond Good and Evil, which we will look at next week, and also Toward a Genealogy of Morals. Those two are phenomenal, and you will see they're more clear. There's a clearer presentation of the arguments that you'll see in Zarathustra. Zarathustra is difficult, and it's maybe deliberately vague, but those two books in 86 and 87, they're quite clear, and they are probably my favorite works of political philosophy ever. So 2 years later, his health is deteriorating, and also his mental health is never good during this time. He is in Basel, or no, I think it was in Germany. I think it was Leipzig. Was it Leipzig? I think it was in Leipzig. Somewhere in Germany, doesn't matter. And the police found him with his arms wrapped around a horse's neck on the street. The horse trying to protect the horse. The horse was being beaten by its owner, and Nietzsche um, just had a what we would say freaked out and was in absolute anguish, and I think started to beat the owner, or at least attacked him, and then tried to protect the horse, and was crying and screaming and yelling, and was, I would say, deeply affected by this act of cruelty. But he was considered to be, by the police, mentally insane, and he was immediately committed to an asylum in Basel. He was released within a year, but was essentially incapacitated and had to live with, I think it was his sister and his aunt, I believe, two relatives for many years. But he declined throughout, didn't publish anything during that time, didn't write anything that was published, I don't think. And he died in 1900 at the age of 55 in Weimar. He did write an autobiography, which that's the final thing we'll look at in this course, Ecce Homo. But he published that. That was published posthumously, but he had written it in 1888. Upper right is him as a young man. I believe that is when he's 24 and has just been appointed to his professorship at the University of Basel. And the bottom right served as probably his most famous portrait from when I believe he was in his late 30s, early 40s, when he was sort of at the height of his productivity. Any questions about the biography, the timeline? All right. Now, this guy, what is this guy doing in this book? And who is he? Well, it helps probably to know, first of all, that Zarathustra is simply another name for Zoroaster, because I'm sure some of you at least have heard of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism. What was Zoroastrianism? What's important is to know what Nietzsche thought it was. So this is a religion that was founded by this guy Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. I think it was 1000, roughly 1000 BC, roughly 1000 BC. And Nietzsche, and by the way, Nietzsche, I think, has a pretty standard opinion about this. Zoroastrianism is the first monotheism, right? There is only one God. Zoroaster, according to Nietzsche, and I believe most scholars of this, was also the first to posit a world divided between good and bad, a binary, good and evil. So that is what happens with monotheism, right? If you reduce all the gods to one God, everything is either of God or not of God. Everything is either godly or ungodly. So a binary immediately follows from monotheism. And that is the argument that's been made about who Zoroaster was, and that's essentially how Nietzsche saw him. All right, so the first monotheist and also the first binary moralist, right? I hope that makes sense. And here's Nietzsche himself. Thankfully, he explained it himself. Why, and this is later, he wrote this in Ecce Homo, his autobiography, a couple of years after he wrote this book, why he chose Zarathustra as the main character in this novel.